Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, safety first. Nuclear power grows ever more important in China's energy mix, prompting a new policy document on emergency responses. And let the buyer beware. From on Baidu forums to fake goods online, we discuss the state of business ethics in China. And we start our program with a major milestone in nuclear safety here in China. For the first time ever, a new policy document is laying out safety measures and emergency preparation in a bid to better coordinate safety in the energy sector. The question is, will it be enough to satisfy critics who continue to worry about the safety of nuclear power?
China's first ever white paper on nuclear emergency preparedness. With nuclear energy a big priority in China's future plans, officials emphasize the balance being struck between development and safety.
We can't forget 3 major nuclear accidents in the world: the 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima nuclear accidents. The reason that we released a white paper on China's nuclear emergency preparedness is to prevent such accidents and make necessary preparation in case an accident should happen. After Fukushima, China has indeed taken corresponding measures to ensure nuclear safety.
Key innovations laid out in the document include a National Nuclear Emergency Response Task Force to handle serious accidents and take part in overseas operations. The force will have more than 300 professionals who will work with existing nuclear emergency teams on search and rescue operations after any nuclear accident. While safety is paramount, the government has big plans for nuclear power in meeting climate change commitments. Coal power, which produces high levels of emissions, provided over 75% of China's energy in 2014. In order to achieve the goals set at the Climate Change Conference in Paris, China will have to cut emissions substantially. Carbon dioxide emissions per unit of GDP will have to drop 60 to 65% by 2030, compared with 2005 levels. China has been using nuclear power since the 1980s, and, along with green energy, its development is seen as essential in the coming years. The country already has 30 reactors in operation, with 24 more under construction.
China has always paid high attention to nuclear emergency work. We keep improving and bettering our national policies to boost our readiness to respond to nuclear emergencies.
China believes it's learned valuable lessons from Japan's Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011. But while national preparations are essential, the policy document also calls for greater international cooperation on nuclear safety. China has signaled its ongoing commitment to nuclear energy, but they're also showing that they're committed to safety and prepared for the worst.
For more on this, we are joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Teng Jianqun, who is the director of the Center for Arms Control at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. Also in the Beijing studio, we have General Zhu Chenghu, a Chinese military expert and analyst. Welcome as well. Meanwhile, joining us from Washington, D.C., we're having Ms. Sharon Squassoni, who is the director and senior fellow of the Proliferation Prevention Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome, ma'am. Well, China already have 30 reactors in operation and more than 20 being built right now. Is this white paper and some of the measures, according to the white paper, to be taken by China sufficient to guarantee nuclear safety?
Sure. I think all the measures taken by the Chinese government actually has been very, efficient in recent, at least several decades. China started its nuclear business from 1950s, and the start is from the military use. Actually, only from 1980s, China began its nuclear, use in civilian sector. So this is a very important sector for the energy development of China, especially in recent 10 years. We have witnessed the fast development. And last year we described the development of nuclear industry with the 8686. 8 units were permitted from the central government, and 6 were under construction. 8 units were in operation, and 6 of them are now in a commercial operation. So I think this is a very important area for the Chinese people to have such a powerful energy.
I see. Ms. Squassoni, from your observation, is that sufficient?
I'm sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. It's hard for me to hear you. Let me just say that, you know, China has the largest construction program right now globally in nuclear power, and it should be doubling its capacity actually in the next 5 years. That's tremendous growth. It's not quite as much as what the U.S. experienced back in the 70s and early 80s. But you know, we learned from our very fast construction pace that there are some dangers in that. And one of the things is, does China have enough personnel in its nuclear safety and regulatory system to really keep a very careful eye out, not just in the manufacturing and construction phase, but also in the operation? I think it will need to beef up its personnel.
General Zhu, according to the latest white paper, we are having at least 25 teams, over 1,300 personnel all over the country at this moment, specifically focusing on nuclear safety. And yet, according to Ms. Squassoni, it seems to be relatively a small number than the scale that China's nuclear development is likely to become. So what do you make of it?
Yeah, I think the number of the experts on the supervision of the nuclear security is quite limited, but I think the number is increasing. I think with the development of the nuclear power stations, I think we will have more experts working on that.
Of course, nuclear safety, we talk a lot about the nuclear power plant. We've seen some of the lessons, 3 Mile, Chernobyl, you know, and also Fukushima in Japan. All of these were devastating incidents. But we have also seen that some of those incidents have not led to any casualty yet. For example, the one in Fukushima. And yet the previous 2 have led to devastating situations and results. Mr. Teng, how much does it have to do with our increasing understanding of how to prevent nuclear disasters and the technologies being used to safeguard nuclear facilities so that to avoid as much as possible?
You know, according to the white paper, I think a lot of measures should be taken to safeguard the stable and sustainable development of our nuclear industry. And for example, the policy, the code of conduct, the training of the people, and also the mechanism construction already on the agenda. I think the most important part for these development actually, in my opinion, is from the law. The law construction, I think, are most important at this stage, because we still have no atomic law or constitution or something like that. This is actually very important foundation for the country to have efficient management or administration of the nuclear energy.
How is international cooperation likely to help in any way in that regard?
Actually, China did have a very good cooperation with IEA, with the United States. For example, in Beijing, we have a Center of Excellence. Its function mainly focused on the training, on the safeguarding of any nuclear facilities. And this is actually a joint project between China and the United States, according to the nuclear summit, signed by President Obama and our President Hu Jintao.
Mr. Squassoni, do you think China and the United States can work better in terms of cooperation, if you can hear me?
I think I heard the question as U.S.-China cooperation in nuclear safety. We've had a long relationship with China. Our nuclear regulatory agencies have been cooperating since China joined the International Atomic Energy Agency in 1984. So all of that is really good. And you know, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is kind of known as the gold standard in nuclear regulation. Whether that's true or not is another question. But those kinds of exchanges that we've had with China over decades, I think, benefit both sides, because you know the U.S. Has been helping to build some reactors in China, and it's really important for us to know how China is organized, how it is implementing certain things like nuclear safety culture in its plants. So I think all of that is to the good. I would say one thing about the white paper that was recently issued. I was very impressed with its transparency and actually how it mentioned some shortfalls in Chinese capabilities. I think all of that is to the good, and it provides an opportunity to improve some things.
Right. Mr. Tang and also General Zhu, it is not just the nuclear power plants, the safety of that we are talking about, but also the nuclear build-up that we have seen in China's neighboring countries. Some say it is also worrisome. For example, in the DPRK, the previous nuclear test, General Zhu in DPRK not long ago, was a big concern for many living on the border in China between the DPRK and China. People do not know what is the standard that country has adopted, and China has not been notified before the test was done, unlike before. So all of these could be huge concerns. What can China do, though?
It's very difficult, you know, because we were not informed. And to be very frank, it's very close to China's territory, about 74 kilometers away from the Baishan County town. So it's a very serious problem. In case it has some radiation or something like that, it will, of course, affect the safety and the security of the Chinese people living not only on the border but also in the interior land of the, especially in northeast part of China. So in this regard, I think what we can do is to increase the cooperation between the members of the world community. That is the only way out. And all countries in this regard, concerning the nuclear security and safety, should be responsible enough and should cooperate with each other. I don't think any single country can solve this sort of issue. It's a global issue.
It is a global issue. Of course, it's fortunate this time, after some testing, we haven't seen anything that's beyond the normal standard. This time, after the DPRK nuclear test on the border between DPRK and China. But Mr. Tang, what do you see as the potential danger? Because it is very likely that our neighbor is going to continue their proliferation, nuclear proliferation, and therefore, what can China do?
Actually, the DPRK nuclear issue has already become a direct and a real challenge or threat to the regional stability and the peace, and also to some countries. For example, we have focused a lot on the attention to the nuclear bomb, on the missile system. So in my opinion, I think we should pay much attention to the nuclear facilities in DPRK. A lot of nuclear facilities, as General Zhu just mentioned, very close to the Chinese border. And I heard some report from the United States saying that in recent years, some nuclear facilities also suffered flood and some other natural disasters. And how can they, DPRK, maintain a safe and very good condition for these facilities? It's not only for the sake of the DPRK, but also for the countries concerned in this region, ROK, China, Japan, and Russia. So I think I quite agree with General Zhu, what mentioned just now. We should cooperate because the threat is not only nuclear bomb, it's nuclear safety and security.
But here's the thing, is there a mechanism under which that countries can work together, including the DPRK?
Yeah. I think the most important watchdog for the nuclear security and safety is RAEA.
That's right.
And so RAEA this time should pay much attention to the nuclear security and safety of DPRK. And so the international community might shift a little bit their attention to this area, not only to the military use, but also civilian use of the nuclear technology in DPRK. So this is a very important moment for the international community to cooperate. I argue that the United States should give some, individual its own interests, or not only make some tension in this region for the sake to deploy troops and weapon systems and to control ROK and Japan. So this is not a control, and this is not one nation's interest. It's the whole community.
Ms. Guasong, what do you make of it? Earlier, while you were adjusting the volume of the earpiece, we are talking about not only the nuclear power plant safety, but also the nuclear programs being developed in China's neighboring countries, for example, at DPRK. What do you make of it?
I just heard the tail end of that, the nuclear program at DPRK. I have traveled to the DPRK actually to talk with them about certain kinds of very limited cooperation, and one thing I have stressed is that they are in need of outside cooperation, particularly in nuclear safety. They tend to say all the right things about having a regulatory structure and that things are independent, but without real peer reviews. I think that any nuclear power plants that they build, even for electricity, could pose some potential risks, not just to themselves, but to the region.
What specifically are you particularly concerned about, Mrs. Guasong, given your knowledge of DPRK's nuclear facilities?
Well, they've been building a light water reactor that they say will provide electricity. You know, nuclear safety starts from the design of the reactor and continues all the way through, pouring the concrete, all the manufacturing processes, the quality assurance of the components. Every single step of the way has to be competent and has to be done with safety in mind. So, we're actually only coming in, halfway into the process. It's not just the operation of the reactor. So the sooner that they can get international assistance, I think the safer everybody will be.
General Zhu, do you think some of these messages that China can also convey to DPRK or convey through IAEA to DPRK?
Yes, of course, because this is not only an issue of the DPRK or China. I think it is the business of the world community. Of course, China is a close neighbor of DPRK. It has, if anything happens, any incident happens, it may produce a very, very direct impact on China. Therefore, we Chinese should cooperate with DPRK on safety and security of nuclear installations.
Are we see already any sign of that?
Not yet. So this is a very challengeable question. Actually, we are facing now. For example, how can we cooperate with DPRK, is very confident in their facilities and the nuclear industry, and always, proudly say this is actually our national, independent, course. So this is a very challengeable topic for the international community, especially for China. How can China cooperate not only in dealing with the nuclear bomb in DPRK, but also to talk about the nuclear safety? How can these facilities in a safe and secure condition, and also to talk about the security, no proliferation of any nuclear technology, fission materials. So I think this is a new topic we should put on the agenda to deal with the DPRK nuclear issue.
I see. We are seeing already early spring that there is going to be the nuclear summit to be held very soon in Washington. So what might be some of the topics on the agenda besides the nuclear safety and the DPRK nuclear issue? How can countries work together? New initiatives be brought up then?
Actually, Nuclear Security Summit is a proposal by President Obama. It started from 2010. And this year is the third summit. I think our leaders will be there and try to produce some, productive result this time. But I think the United States, of course, has different approaches to the understanding of nuclear energy. The United States, especially President Obama, only addresses the nuclear security, anti-nuclear terrorism, not the nuclear safety. Only in Seoul, during the second summit in Seoul, the ROK side gave some, implication on the nuclear safety just because of the disaster in Fukushima. So I think this time we should, address the importance to cooperate in dealing with nuclear safety, not only security.
Mrs. Guasoni, what is your take about this, particularly with the upcoming nuclear safety summit, nuclear security summit, rather?
Yeah, so I agree with your other guest. This nuclear security summit process has been very narrowly defined. So the idea back in 2010 was to take the most vulnerable material, vulnerable to terrorists, and secure it within 4 years. This is actually the fourth summit. There was one in 2012 in Seoul and then in the Netherlands. Very narrowly focused, not on nuclear safety, not on disarmament or non-proliferation. That said, I think in the intervening years with the Fukushima accident, that there's been a lot more attention to nuclear safety, and people want more mechanisms to address nuclear safety. Both in nuclear safety and nuclear security, the regimes are voluntary. It's really important to remember that. So there are no mandatory standards or legal obligations, and that's why it's very important for countries to keep talking to each other, to exchange best practices and peer reviews so that everyone's safety and security can improve.
Yes, indeed. Sharon Guasoni, Zhu Chenghu, and Teng Jianjun, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. Let the buyer beware. From Baidu forums to fake goods online, we discuss the state of business ethics in China. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. Internet companies often give us services for free, with their profits coming from selling our data on to the advertisers. However, many felt Chinese internet giant Baidu went too far when it handed over moderation of a medical forum to a dubious for-profit medical company. It's just one of those host of controversies that have put a spotlight on business ethics in China, especially online.
Baidu's hemophilia forum was a source of hope for many. People suffering from the condition shared experiences and gained strength through solidarity. The last thing they were expecting was a dodgy medical company invading their space. But that's exactly what happened when Baidu sold moderating rights to a dubious unlicensed medical firm. The revelation sparked a massive backlash. Baidu handed the forum back to the old moderators, but anger remains.
The reason why we built up this forum is to help people having the same experiences. Advertising is common for internet companies, but Baidu needs to check whether the ad is true or false, especially those in the health-related forums. It's not about money, it's about life.
Ma Yicai, which was his online name, was the one who exposed the scandal. But his forum wasn't the only victim. And today, despite the controversy, many medical forums are still being run by fake medical groups. For its part, Baidu claims it's halted commercialized operation of all its illness-related forums, adding it will invite non-profit organizations to run these groups. But it's all part of a wider crisis of business ethics in China's online space. Online ticketing scandals have seen major companies like Ctrip.com, China's largest online travel booking website, selling tickets that turned out to be invalid. Online marketplace Alibaba is also routinely accused of providing a forum for the sale of fake goods. Meanwhile, Tencent is seen in some quarters as stifling innovation through abuse of its monopoly position. Even US multinationals have run afoul of authorities. Google was once fined $500 million for allowing online Canadian pharmacies to advertise drugs to US consumers, a breach of US law. China's online marketplace is still relatively young. Some view these excesses as growing pains that will be tamed as the market matures. But in the here and now, it remains a serious problem, with vulnerable consumers sorely in need of greater protection against unscrupulous operators.
For more on the business ethics online, we are joined from Vancouver by Mr. Jay Huang, who is the former managing director of Intel China and now founding partner of Jadestone Venture. Welcome, sir. And also in New York, we are joined by Max Wolf, who is a professor of economics from New School University of New York. Welcome, professor, as well. What do you make of the recent series of scandals involving Chinese internet companies? Mr. Huang.
I think those scandals reflect, I think those Chinese internet companies need to check on their social responsibilities and also their moral standards. And I think this is a breach and the public trust to them.
Professor Wolf, is it really all depending on corporate social responsibilities, or should that be institutional requirements for these companies?
So it's a great question, and I think we need to see both the regulatory involvement and also the mores and standards of the firms co-evolve. Most of the problems that we're seeing in some of the larger Chinese companies today, whether it's Baidu or Tencent, are problems that we're somewhat familiar with because they're very, very similar to problems that we saw in the US and continue to. And partly that's because we don't really know how to, and we haven't settled in on a social set of norms or regulations about privacy and misrepresentation online. One. Two, the internet has tended to grow much faster and penetrate much deeper into society than the regulatory oversight of it has facilitated. And so we have a constant situation where regulators are playing catch up and they're often responding to outrage as opposed to preventing it.
Mr. Huang, can we understand it as if similar things will happen again and we cannot do much to prevent it from happening?
I think that's maybe the case. I think it's also related to those internet giants. They are in either dominant or monopoly situation in the marketplace, and so I don't think they care that much and then what the consumers think about and their practice, as long as they have no alternatives.
Mr. Wolf?
Yeah, so I think the dominant firms in China, particularly what we sometimes call the BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, have been co-evolved in some ways with a regulatory framework that's given them slightly better access to their home market than all companies get. And I think that it's probably a reasonable argument to say that if you grew in part with some protection from major international competitors, you may owe a little more social responsibility to your populace, your user base, than a giant transnational that's just fighting it out with everyone else. But I do think that the lack of competition in any place, in any country, at any time, does tend to make companies less responsive to the desires of their users. But I mean, I will say that all these big abuses we're seeing in China, we've also seen in the US, where in some cases the markets were more competitive and almost identical abuses occurred.
At this moment, Mr. Huang, we just haven't seen any international agreement among governments or even within the business communities about how to protect the big data and whether individual consumers, once their data is being collected, let's just say by the internet companies, how the latter should be responsible for the former. So at this moment, will these companies be found guilty, first of all? And secondly, how can consumers protect themselves? Is it impossible?
I think there are two issues, and the first, this scandals is not about the misuse of private information. It's actually misleading information and get put on the internet. And related to the issue, you brought it up. It is a serious issue, and I don't think there is a clear solution or definition on the internet side of it, how to protect the private data. Almost on every free or so-called free internet services, there will be long agreement saying, you agree to allow me to do this or that. And you found out that actually they're asking all kinds of information which may or may not link to the specific services that are providing. So I think this is a big issue globally. Nobody seems to have a very clear way, say, how to resolve it, and because it does, those information does provide a lot of benefit and to the consumers who give this information to the other side.
But can consumers just, whether it's China or elsewhere, just vote with their feet? If you are asking too much information, private information, I'm going to go to others. Do they have the option? Mr. Huang.
In China, I think the option is very limited. And for example, right now, if you're in Android-based phones, and so literally you have no control, nobody regulate, and the Android apps are being developed and also used in China. For Apple and handsets, we know Apple have played a gatekeeper role for the applications running on the iOS. So I suppose if a consumer using iPhone get a malware from somebody else, and he'll pick up the phone to call an Apple for complaining or for solution, or even for compensation.
Professor Wolf, do we have a solution?
I don't think we have a perfect solution. I think we need a little more articulated regulatory environment. I think something else needs to happen, which has been slow everywhere in China as well, which is the new currency of the internet is privacy. Every time you get anything for free, you are the product. And anytime you get anything at a substantive discount, you're probably relaxing the privacy and business ethics standards of your counterparty to get that discount. Last but not least, if you do see a lot of these platform problems, whether that's Ctrip or Baidu or Alibaba, often the big trouble comes when these companies try to push up their profit margin by acting as a platform and letting third-party users go on their platform. They take a fee and they make significant money and profitability off that, but historically they've decided that they more or less take no responsibility for the actions of these third parties on their platforms. I think if we tighten up those rules, many of the more egregious violations could be prevented.
But the question is, Professor Wolf, if we all understand how devastating the situation could be, and we all understand at this moment now the third party could be the problem, why there has not been sufficient law enforcement and regulations coming out from various governments in order to make sure individual consumers' rights are going to be protected?
So it's a great question. In the United States, it has something to do with lobbying. I think the Chinese situation is a bit different. One thing is that we tend to see legislation move through consensus processes run by committees and groups of experts. And we tend to see internet business models migrate, evolve, and mutate at the speed of the internet. And so we sort of have a 20th century speed regulatory process and a 21st century speed evolution of business model. And that creates these gaps, which I think you rightly point out, have led to some serious misadventures. My guess is people will only take it seriously on the business side when people start to do, as you suggest, vote with their feet. And that can mean, in the egregious case, just not using the system as opposed to even going to a competitor who may have similar problems if they exist.
That is the problem, isn't it, Mr. Huang? Even when it comes to the competitors have the same problem or a very similar problem as the one you are using. So who else can you go to? In China, why hasn't the regulations and laws been catching up to the latest development of the internet businesses? Particularly, we have been talking so much these days in China of internet governance. What about the protection of individuals' rights?
I think there are two roles that government can play. One is to protect consumers' rights. Another one is to make sure and to break up monopoly so we can have the competition. As we all know, without competition, there will be no innovation. For the first role, is actually quite complicated and difficult for government to play. For example, we shouldn't rely on government to say, which individual practice and each company can or cannot do. On the other hand, if a government can guarantee there will be no monopoly, there will be enough competition, I think the competition, the good company with a good behavior will eventually win the consumers' heart and then will eventually dominate the marketplace.
But
I think
Huang,
that area maybe
Huang,
is more important.
Mr. Huang, may I jump in? Because Professor Wolf, coming from the United States, which is supposed to be quite a market economy to a certain extent, but still he is describing very similar situations and challenge as China is having right now. So even though probably on a different scale. So is competition necessarily going to help us to find solution for everything, Mr. Huang?
I think there are problems in the U.S., and as Professor Wolf mentioned, but I don't think they're on the same level as we see in China. And also, I think you look back to history, I think there are enough competition in the U.S. So that's why we always see the new innovative companies are popping up in the U.S.
Well, Professor Wolf, it seems that we always believe there are more serious problems on our own land, isn't it? Professor Wolf, what would you make of the next step? Legislation, for example, inside the United States, elsewhere in the world, international communities, cooperation among governments, within business community. Will internet companies be able to find their next stage of prosperity if they continue to do what they're exactly doing now?
So these are very profound questions. I'm not sure that I have answers as good as the questions, but I do think we know some things. So our lives are moving online. The importance of online is rising to us, unfortunately to some thieves and con artists as well. We do need a better internet security infrastructure. Competition probably does help, but I think we can be pretty well assured that legislation and regulation will evolve more slowly than these business models. So I think what we need to do, perhaps through community groups as well as business groups is figure out what our privacy is worth and how and where we get discounts for giving away our privacy. It should be formally recognized, recorded, and measured, and so it isn't this amorphous thing where people just feel violated until there's a criminal act, and then they run from one provider to another if they even have that opportunity. We need to make this a little bit more overt and measured, and I think that, sunshine is usually the best disinfectant.
Mr. Huang, do you believe in sunshine?
Oh, yes, of course.
What do you think? Where does that sunshine come from for China to clean up this environment for internet companies?
I think the government should play a role, but I do not hope that they're like a hands-on to regulate every individual practice the internet companies or other companies are doing. And we saw the bad failure and before. And also the technology will move very fast. So any regulation will be always behind those technology innovation. So I tend to think it's more important for the government, maybe the number one responsibility for them is to make sure they'll have enough competition in the field, and then to make sure their monopoly will not be there.
All right. Jay Huang joining us from Vancouver and Max Wolf from New York. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us, and have a great weekend. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of our program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us. Or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching. And tune in again next week for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night and have a great weekend.